Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Ramon Charles, Director of Communications at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and a proud member of NABJ. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is thankful for the contributions of NABJ and NAHJ. Your work is so important to building public understanding of the challenges and opportunities that our country faces. That is why we are proud to support this luncheon. Our mission is to build a more just and inclusive future for everyone. Our work in education is aimed at helping to build a future where race and income are not predictors of student success. We are working with communities to ensure that every young person enters adulthood with the skills and abilities they need to reach their full potential, and that every teacher is equipped with the capacity, tools, and research they need to help get them there. The return to school this year will be unlike any other in our country. Educators across the country are preparing for this upcoming school year amidst the impact of inequalities amplified by the pandemic and a national reckoning on race. Today's conversation with Rehema Ellis on education could not be coming at a more timely moment. Rehema is an award-winning journalist who has been at the forefront of education reporting. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rehema.
Thanks so much, Ramon, and thanks to the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative for sponsoring this event. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Rehema Ellis. This is a year of first. It's the first time we've ever had a virtual luncheon for NABJ and NAHJ convention. I, for one, hope that it will be the last, that this record will stand for a long time, because I hope that this time next year we'll all be in the same place where we can break bread together and actually see each other and hug each other and converse with each other face to face. There's always so much to talk about when it's the subject of education, which is a topic that is high on the list of a lot of Americans, despite the fact that it doesn't get nearly the kind of attention that I think that it should, being the education correspondent. But this year, everybody seems to be talking about education and the impact that it's having in our community, particularly around the fact that COVID-19 has thrown us all into a tailspin on every single platform, and particularly education. It seems like our nation has been catapulted, I should say, into a painful awakening. I was in Atlanta not so long ago for the funeral of Rayshard Brooks, and it was at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the historic church of Dr. Martin Luther King. And a woman there, a Black woman with her son, came up, and she said she wanted him to see what was happening in our country. She also said that she thought while God did not create this virus, she thinks that God made everybody stop with this virus. And it gave all of us a chance to see exactly what was going on in the question of George Floyd in police custody. And since we were in Atlanta, what was happening and what happened with Rayshard Brooks. It also gave us an opportunity to take a look at the racial inequities that are occurring across all platforms in this country and in our schools. A lot to talk about, and so let's get to it with our first panel. Let me introduce you to them. Phyllis Lockett, founder and CEO of Leap Innovation, headquartered in Chicago. Its mission, I am understanding, is to change or transform how students learn. And it's been a driving force behind the Chicago charter school movement. And which is interesting to me as you're talking about change, because the original concept of charter schools was to be a platform of the innovation in education. So I'm delighted that you're here with us today, Phyllis. Also, Cynthia Robinson Rivers, founder and head of school at Van Ness Elementary in Washington, D.C. It's a school that makes a priority caring for the whole child, and not just the academic, but the social and emotional aspect of that child as well. And one of the things, Cynthia, I was reading about some great stories about your school. It's happening in a lot of places, but I understand that at the beginning of the day, you and other teachers are right there at the front door, greeting students and giving them a high five. I would like to imagine that happening when I go into work at 30 Rock, if my boss was at the front of the office giving me a high five, how my day would go. I think that you set up a position, a platform for children to do well, because right at the beginning of school, You're telling them that you care about them. I think that's terrific. So let's talk about education and again, how we've been catapulted into this arena of recognizing disparities and how Black communities have been disproportionately hard hit by this COVID virus. Cynthia, let me ask the question. We have a patchwork approach to reopening our schools. What do you think should be done? Should children go back into school this September or August, as the case may be for some communities?
It's such a complicated question. I'm not sure, and I think it largely depends on the local health conditions. But one thing I do know is we think it's really critical for our students who are furthest from opportunity, who had the most difficulty engaging in distance learning when school was closed, or who have a disability, to be able to have some kind of touch point at school if we reopen in a hybrid learning format. Those are the kids who had the toughest time either engaging in a computer interface or just being able to log on. And so being able to welcome them physically into the school building is something I think is important. Because
one of the things, Cynthia, that this virus has done, it's shown us that in some instances where children who were doing well in the school, the brick and mortar building, some of them are still doing well outside of school, learning remotely. Other students who have challenges, students who have, you point out, have disabilities, and it requires more assistance for those children. They require even more assistance in remote learning environment. True?
Absolutely, very true. And what we found as a school community is that we have to be family and caregiver facing as much as we are student facing, so that we can support families in supporting their child. Whether that's through coaching around video conferencing and the platforms that we're using, or sending home, as we are in the summer learning program that we're doing, a physical set of materials to complement the online learning that the students are doing on the computer.
Phyllis, one of the things I've read that you said is basically that this outbreak, this COVID-19 outbreak, didn't necessarily have to be as hard on our children as it's turned out to be. What do you mean by that?
Yes, thank you so much, Rehema, for having me. And I did want to clarify something. I was behind the charter school, the scale of this charter school movement in Chicago when I started. But when I realized that we needed to transform learning and that the digital divide was growing, and that while I'm really passionate about charter schools, we were really tweaking learning, honestly, tweaking the education model from that was built 100 years ago, from an agrarian economy. So the reason why I wrote what I wrote about why learning didn't have to be so hard on our children is because we needed to shift the model of learning before COVID. It's quite frankly more evident. The light the lid has been ripped off since COVID, and that we have relied for over 100 years on a single channel of learning for our students in a digital economy. You know, we are so unprepared for what is needed for the design of learning for the fourth industrial revolution. And so that's why I wrote that piece.
And to your point, you knew this before we got smacked in the face with the realities of COVID, correct?
That's right. I started my organization, Leap Innovations, about 6 years ago because realizing that we were not in a place of scaling innovation quickly enough to align with the needs and the demands of the digital economy. And so, you know, what we were proposing at Leap is to transform learning to instead of designing around a school building, is to design around the learning and needs of every single student. And that's what we call personalized learning. And what it suggests is that learning has to be focused on the learner. It has to be tailored to the learner's needs. It has to be mastery-based, competency-based. It has to be connected to real-world learning opportunities. And it has to be powered and leveraged across multiple learning modalities. That includes technology, that includes in-person. It is very much designed around building the agency and ownership of the learner, and to better prepare the learner for you know, for the future job force.
The amazing part about this, as it is labeled as innovation, it seems like almost it's a duh Why aren't we doing that for all children? In some sense, I think we do it with what's called IEPs. For those in our audience who are listening, individualized education programs. It seems to me every kid ought to have an individualized education program. It sounds like what you were trying to do, Phyllis.
Yeah, it's very, I almost couple it with Montessori. So for many of you who have children who may be in a Montessori environment where quite frankly, the teacher is a facilitator of the learning, and the student is empowered to have choice, to co-design their learning experience with their teacher. In our case, we are also leveraging technology and leveraging different modalities of learning to enable that student agency and autonomy.
This COVID crisis has exposed inequities in learning. Cynthia, what do you think our classrooms would look like if there was equity? What would it mean if a child has disciplinary issues? Right now, it often means if you're Black or Hispanic, you might be sent to the principal's office and then sent out of school. And if you're white, you might be sent to the guidance counselor's office or to the nurse's office. How would some of those issues change if there were equity in education? Cynthia?
Yeah, I will start by saying before you get to equity in school and in the classroom, we realized, and this was surfaced through the pandemic and the closure of school, that we had to address inequities that were occurring before students even got to school. So for our first month of school closure, we focused on addressing food needs of our families, making sure every family had a device, a laptop, and Wi-Fi, because those basic needs were unmet, and we couldn't think about the academic learning that we wanted to quickly engage in virtual formats without first addressing those more basic prerequisite needs. I'm glad you asked about discipline protocols, because there certainly are tons of inequities that exist in traditional schools that we try to address through our approach to behavior and discipline at our school. We really come with the premise that when students are misbehaving, when they're acting inappropriately at school, it's a form of communication, and it's showing, one, that they have a need, or two, that they simply haven't learned the appropriate behaviors. And so if as a school leader and if all of my teachers have that mindset, the way we respond to behavior is through teaching versus punishing. And we have a system that encourages that as an alternative to harsh punishments in response to behavior.
One of the things, I'm sorry to interrupt, because one of the things this makes me think about is, why isn't that a natural response in all of our schools? Children are prone to misbehaving. It's just kind of age-appropriate behavior, I would say. I mean, I have a son. He's not perfect, and every now and then I had to discipline, but I didn't throw him out of the house. Why would we throw children out of schools?
I think rewards and punishment-based systems are in place in our society far beyond school. When you think about our prison system, when we think about how we respond to other human beings outside of the teacher-student relationship, we typically rely on managing behavior through extrinsic rewards or punishments. And in many cases, it's effective, right? So you can manage and change behavior through giving a child a negative consequence. What we're trying to do in teaching appropriate behaviors actually takes longer and is harder. But what it does is it builds intrinsic motivation in the child. It helps the child understand the why behind the appropriate behavior. And it gives them a skill that will last beyond the place in which those extrinsic rewards or punishments exist. So a longer lasting life skill of self-management, self-regulation, or agency and confidence to alter the world around you, rather than behaving because you're fearful of some negative consequence or hopeful about a reward.
Phyllis, jump in here. Do you agree with that? I mean, what would you say equity in education, what should it look like?
Yes, I agree 100%. I want to take a step back and think about equity, starting with first and foremost, the way our schools are funded, which in most cases across this country is based on property taxes, which by definition is inequitable, especially when you think about the school funding in Black and Brown communities. Let's also think about the access to technology and the reality that many of our Black and Brown students did not have the appropriate level of devices as well as technological access to be able to engage effectively in digital learning. That should be a right. At this point, technology should be as accessible as heat and water. So, those are really big deals. I think as you think about the, there's plenty of data as as Cynthia's talking about the restorative justice approach that needs to be in education. There's plenty of data that talks about the school to prison pipeline, because the way we have structured this top-down one-size-fits-all system, which is why my point is that we have got to transform the system. When you look at schools that are doing more innovation and are doing personalized learning, the teachers aren't spending time telling kids what to do and telling them to sit still and fold their hands. Kids are encouraged to have choice, to have agency, to learn, and be able to express themselves, not suppress themselves. Our teachers are taught about how to elevate a student because of their differences, not penalize them because of their differences.
And that makes a big difference in a child's desire to learn based on how they're approached. Agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have got to turn this entire paradigm on its head, quite frankly. When you think about equity and what that looks like across our country, not only do we have to think about, obviously, police reform, we've got to think about education reform. It is the lever, the pertinent, most important lever that is going to transform the conditions that Cynthia talked about, the broader conditions of why we are seeing the pervasive education gap, achievement gap, and it translates into a massive wealth gap in this country. And so we have got to think seriously about, if we are looking at the distance of preparedness of our students in order to compete, it's going to require a complete redesign of how we think about what learning is and what education looks like in this country.
The question becomes one of, is there really an appetite to do that? As I've said earlier, we've been talking about education reform in this country for decades, and we are here at this moment right now talking about it still. I'm wondering, where is the appetite? Do you think that this moment of civil unrest that we're currently in will be sustaining for change? And will those folks who are watching this, our students, our journalists, is this a story to write about, to bring this into the forefront, if you will, of awareness of the American public of where attention needs to be placed if we are going to resolve these inequities in education? Somebody's got to write about it, correct?
I think this audience needs to be screaming the story at the rooftops. We have to. If we don't take the responsibility to do it, who will? We must not go back to normal. I've heard so many times, a lot of, we just want to go back to normal. No, absolutely not. Normal was not working for the majority of Black and Brown kids in this country. It is a direct link to the lack of investment, the lack of mobility, upward mobility, education. And so if we want to fix that, if we're serious about fixing that, we have got to write about and demand a higher order approach around learning and education in this country.
Cynthia, is it a demand? Is this something that people can write about? Are parents, are communities demanding this? I mean, as journalists, we don't go in and tell people to demand it. We write about whether they are or they are not. Maybe that's a story to be written about if there is not that kind of sustained energy around these stories. Or is it not that the community isn't there demanding it? Are we not there covering it as journalists? Cynthia?
Many members of our community are demanding it, but unfortunately, a good portion of our community members, especially those furthest from opportunity, are dealing with so many other life issues that they actually aren't right now demanding it. And that's where I feel educators and schools can come in to encourage the participation, the equal participation of our families through family engagement strategies, through giving them equity of voice, through asking their opinion of what they want for their children, and then really listening and taking that opinion into consideration as we design schools and think about policies. Because unfortunately, if I think about my school and my students whose families are struggling most during this pandemic, whose parents may be out of a job, life needs are consuming. I would be lying if I said that they have time right now to advocate for education policy reform, although I'm sure they want it. And I think that's where schools can support our families in supporting that kind of advocacy for the community.
So how hopeful are you if the community is not in a place where it can focus its attention on this, to your point, because there are so many other life and death issues, quite honestly, that are pounding at the door? Where will the change come from? How can the change happen? Ladies, either one of you.
I am hopeful because I'll tell you why. We were talking about, first of all, the youth, the students. We have found in the work we've done over the last 6 years at LEAP, we've worked with over 140 schools in Chicago. We've got students that are empowered, that whose esteems have been built in confidence, and they are ready to take it. We have principal leaders and educators, and I'm talking veteran educators who were inherently working in a pretty rigid one-size-fits-all system, that have taken the leadership to change their entire school models with LEAP, and they say they will never go back to the old way of teaching again. They have shown that they have been able to deliver learning in a COVID era because they had put the systems and structures in place. We had taught their teachers to teach across multiple modalities. Students were used to having more ownership for their learning, and our kids were able to thrive. I really also want your audience to write about that our Black and Brown kids actually can thrive in a digital arena and succeed. I see so many articles about the deficit orientation around Black and Brown communities and all the things that we don't have and the gaps that we have. But actually, we have evidence of students thriving in this context. And that is that's what's going to set them apart, again, toward their future, which is what the purpose of education really needs to be.
So the deficit is not because an inability to manage the technology. The deficit is because of the lack of the technology in the students' hands. And then the lack of the broadband to really allow them to move quickly on this technology. In other words, without broadband, a laptop may as well be a brick. It's just about it. Maybe a brick would be more useful.
And it's more than the technology. It literally is about the design of learning. Like Cynthia was talking about, it really does have to be anchored in a social and emotional learning construct. It has to be one that gives students trust and agency over their learning. It has to be one that provides rigor and access to standards-based curriculum. It's all of those things that enable this type of approach to really thrive.
So you're saying the design of learning, not the design.
It is the design of learning. Absolutely. We cannot rely solely on a one-size-fits-all. All students have to, 100% of their learning comes from a physical location in the particular geography they live in. This is not even relatable to, again, what the digital economy is going to demand. Our kids need to learn across multiple modalities, not just technology. We're talking more connected to out-of-school programming, more connected to internships and apprenticeships, more connected to advanced placement opportunities. That holistically needs to be the full learning experience of a student, not just what they get in a classroom environment. And at LEAP, we are redesigning schools to do exactly that. That inside learning and outside learning is coming together to enable the social capital and access for the full expansive learning the kids need.
And Cynthia, as we come to the end of this, I want to give you the last word. As Phyllis was talking about that holistic aspect of learning for children, you've got Van Ness, it's an elementary school, it's in Washington, D.C. You are engaged in trying to make that happen for your children, and it is a public school?
We are a public school. We sure are. And the type of connected to real life, authentic learning where kids have agency is exactly what we try to emphasize. And Phyllis is right. If you take an asset-based approach rather than deficit mindset about our kids, you'll see that they can and will thrive even in this alternative setting. We have examples of children who had a really hard time in the traditional format of school, sitting and listening and learning an I do, we do, you do model. Who, when their teacher says, what problem in your house can you solve using what you've learned about magnets in our most recent unit of study? You wouldn't believe the things that the kids did in their homes using magnets based upon the academic learning that they just had with their teacher. And it's that kind of motivating kids, giving them challenges that are meaningful and relevant to them, and connecting it to their academic learning. We try to do that at Van Ness, and I think that this opportunity, this virtual learning, is a time when we can expand that kind of learning to more kids and in more schools.
I hope that the members of this organization will engage themselves in tracking the progress of what both of you are doing in your respective locations to try and reduce this horrible inequity that we have in too many of our schools, affecting too many of our children. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us as we get this luncheon conference underway. Phyllis Lockett and Cynthia Robinson Rivers, a pleasure. Thanks so much. Thanks all of you for watching. Don't go away. More of our conversation coming up. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Rehema Ellis as we continue our conversation about COVID-19 and racial equity and the national reckoning in public education. I want to welcome our next panel, and starting with Travis Bristol, PhD, Assistant Professor, University of California, Berkeley, Graduate School of Education, former New York City teacher. Love that. Wish you were still here as I sit here in New York. A couple of things that we're going to talk about with you that I know that you're very interested in, and that includes support for teachers of color and retention for educators of color. Also with us, John King, President and CEO, the Education Trust. Part of your mission, I understand, John, is to close the achievement gap from preschool to college. You're also a former Secretary of Education under the Obama years after Arne Duncan left. And Carrie Rodriguez, I saved you for last because of our Boston connection. Founding president of the National Parents Union and a mother of 3 sons, had some struggles in education yourself, and you said, I'm not going to be stymied by it. An award-winning journalist yourself, you didn't just gripe, you got up and did something and formed this, formed this union of parents who struggle to find resources, voices, and people who will listen to them, and you're giving them hope. So thank you very much for what you do, Carrie. Thank all of you for what you're doing. Let's get started here. When we talk about inequities in education, I can't help but think about the fact that we are 66 years past Brown versus Board of Education. And that was that landmark Supreme Court decision in 1954 that basically said separate but equal in education is not equal. And yet we're in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis, and it has brought to the forefront in a powerful way inequities in education. Travis, let me start with you. Why do you think we are still here some 66 years after the Supreme Court said this is not where we should be?
I think we're still here because we are still grappling with the other part of that Supreme Court ruling that said all deliberate speed. And we are still taking this sort of deliberate speed to make schools equal. I think that we are here because we are here because we live in a country where the white power structure still does not believe that Black people are equal. And so because we're taking all deliberate speed, and because there is this belief that Black people are not equal, we have not created the conditions for equal opportunity were people who have been historically at the margins, and that specifically are people who are of African descent.
And John, we've been battling this for, as we point out, I say 66 years, but it really has been much longer than that. Separate has not been equal. The question becomes one for you, as someone who's been in a policy-making position. Why is it the policies have not changed so that we have greater equity in our education system for all of our children, regardless of their color or the zip code that they live in?
Yeah, I think I agree with Travis. I think in many ways it comes down to people are most interested in their own kids and often are not as committed to other people's children. And the result is we give the least to the students who need the most. Low-income students and students of color get less access to quality early childhood education, less access to resources, less access to quality teachers, less access to school counselors. And then that has cascading consequences in terms of post-secondary outcomes, employment outcomes. But if you are affluent and you live in a well-resourced school district, it turns out just fine for you. And so this really is a question of, are we willing to invest in everyone's education?
Well, Carrie, you know this firsthand, and I don't understand. I'm not being naive. I really don't understand why this isn't seen as an American issue. It's not just an issue affecting children who are brown or black or Asian. I think it was, who was it that said, if you want to change the economic outcome in America, give every kid a diploma that's of real value. That'll change the economic circumstances we have in America. As a parent and someone who's put together a parents' union, how enormous is this fight that you see yourself up against to gain equity in our schools, Carrie?
Well, it's an enormous fight. I mean, disassembling generational institutional racism is the fight of our lives, and people have been trying to disassemble it for generations. So we're taking steps. We're having more aggressive conversations, but this is a process. And boy, it is too slow for us. What we're here to do is to try to ramp up the urgency. I was expelled from a public school. I got my GED from Boston Public Schools. And then I watched, I was able to scratch and claw my way to college by the grace of God. But I became the mother of 3 little boys. My oldest son has special needs. In kindergarten, he was suspended 36 times. They had already been up on him when he was 6 years old. Yeah. So the cycle continues. The disruption has not occurred, and the fight goes on. It's what we have to do. Folks like myself, like John, like Travis, we don't have the luxury of this being a hobby. We have our own skin in the game. So we're hopeful, that these conversations we're having now will make some progress, but it's just too slow.
Yeah. So one of the things that you spend some time looking at is recruiting and retaining teachers of color. Talk to me about why that is so important, particularly in reference to what Carrie has just said about her child in elementary school being suspended 36 times or thereabouts. If that child had been the child of a white child of a white teacher, might it have been a different outcome?
Yeah. So I would say that that in my own research, what I've tried to do is to connect the experiences of, or what I found is that the experiences of Black children are also connected to the experiences of Black teachers. To sort of piggyback off of what Carrie said, my own son, when he was in preschool, I remember coming one day to pick him up, and the director said he needed to take a 2-week break. And it was several years later, under Secretary King, the Office of Civil Rights put out this report that Black preschoolers were being suspended. And it was at that moment that I understood that this wasn't only happening to me and my Black boy, that this was something that was very similar to Carrie's son, that this was happening across the United States, starting as early as preschool. And so what I found in my own research, that the experiences of Black children in many ways mirror the experiences of Black teachers. For Black children are suspended and expelled at higher rates than their white peers, and Black teachers leave school. They have higher rates of turnover at a higher rate than their white peers. And that happens because Black teachers are not given the resources to do their best work, and they leave out of frustration, very similar to what happens in schools, that we do not give teachers the resources to support Black children. And so we move quickly to discipline rather than to teach. And so my work has really tried to say that actually what's happening to Black children is also happening to Black teachers. We're not creating the conditions for Black children to learn and for Black teachers to teach.
And John, Secretary, when you looked at this from a policy standpoint, being in an administration has tried to have some impact on making a change, can you talk to us about the level of success, frustration, and where you come down now in terms of your hope that we could be on the brink of some substantive change happening now in this era of COVID-19, but also in an era of civil unrest around George Floyd?
Yeah. Well, there were areas of important progress during the Obama administration. We saw a very significant increase in graduation rates from high school, particularly for students of color. We saw an increase in students of color going on to college, and those were encouraging signs, but the improvement was not fast enough for President Obama, not fast enough for me, certainly not fast enough to close these opportunity gaps. I do think COVID-19 coupled with this moment of national reckoning around racial justice creates an opportunity. And the opportunity is to hold people to their pledges of solidarity. Every school district, every higher ed institution, every company practically put out a statement saying, we believe Black Lives Matter. Well, now the question is, show us in who you hire, show us in whether or not you look at the curriculum and create windows and mirrors so kids can see themselves reflected in the authors they read, the characters they read about, the history they study. Show us in the school climate you create, change the discipline policies that result in the kind of disparities that Travis referred to. Stop using corporal punishment. We still have more than 15 states that use corporal punishment, that have adults hit students with wooden objects as a way to change their behavior. It's totally fraudulent worldview around how children learn, but it continues. And so this is a moment where people need to match their rhetoric to reality. Let's see the substance of those pledges of solidarity.
To see the substance of those pledges of solidarity carried out here before an audience of journalists, what would you employ us to do as we try to track this, as we try to write stories about this, to come to people like you who are watching it intensely to say, how are we doing? What's the progress or lack thereof? Do you want to see more of that from us as journalists?
I think we need to continue to ask deep questions about inequities. As a parent from where I sit, when we talk about the idea of reopening schools, I'm scared for a number of different reasons. Not just scared of COVID-19. I'm scared that I cannot trust a system that has failed me, has failed my kids so many times. When they tell me, oh, no, don't worry about it, we're going to disinfect everything, I have no trust. There has been no restorative justice with me or my community. There's no relationships that's been built with me so that I have any capacity to trust them when they say they're going to take care of my children should schools reopen. Even the idea of sending our kids back into a hybrid model goes back to my fears around the disciplinary process. Because what I know, and exactly what these gentlemen have been talking about, the disproportionality of my children being pushed into the disciplinary process is very real. My child with ADHD and autism will be identified as being aggressive, not high-spirited. My children going back into school, should they violate social distancing norms or not wear their mask because they're 7, 9, and 13-year-old boys who aren't going to adhere to social distancing, are prime candidates for being put into the disciplinary process. Should they be violating those things, where a white child may be overlooked and said, oh, well, Tommy, don't worry about it, just try again next time. My child's going to be called out for that. So asking deep questions and tracking disproportionality on all levels, whether it's exposure to COVID-19, whether or not we are engaging with parents to let them know what the risks are, taking a look at disciplinary processes when it comes to who is being called out for not adhering to social distance. All of these things, are very concerning to me as a parent of 3 Latino boys who are prime candidates for the school to prison pipeline. Like, this is just adding on to the fear factor here. So I need you all to be asking very deep questions and continuing to be like a pit bull of the state when it comes to tracking inequity and asking these deep questions.
Travis, I think that I'm wondering, do you have the same apprehension that Carrie has about sending your son to school?
I do, sending my son and my daughter now. I do, and that apprehension comes first with realizing that before we can send our children back to school, we have to think about how we can bring teachers back to school. Before we can think about the conditions for learning, I think we have to first think about the conditions for teaching. And so as it relates to sending children back to school, I think we have to first support teachers to spend time thinking about their own trauma of teaching children whose parents may have passed or whose parents may have been sick. We have to bring back teachers and support them. Give them tools for how to teach in a e-platform. And so we have to attend first to supporting teachers and creating the conditions so that teachers can teach before we can bring our children back. So I think that we have to first start with teachers before we can think about students and bring students back.
John, it's a very interesting question and consideration. Do you think we are thinking about teachers as we talk about reopening schools? We have this patchwork approach to reopening, but I don't hear people talking a lot about teachers. I hear people talking about the need for children to go back to school. Excuse me. I have not met one person yet, not one, who doesn't want their children to be educated. Not one. What I hear from parents is, and what I'm hearing from Carrie right now is, I want my child to be educated in an environment that affirms my child, that respects my child, that looks at my child as being worthy of respect and consideration. Are we getting at that? Do you see on a policy level that that's something that's coming from our policymakers to make certain that that is guaranteed for all parents and their children and teachers as well?
No, frankly, I mean, if you look at this current moment, you have the President of the United States and the current administration telling people that they should go back to school, even if it's unsafe, that we should ignore all of the science, all of the public health information, and send kids to school at great risk to them, to their families, to their teachers, to school staff. And it's sort of characteristic of what has been a reckless and irresponsible approach to managing this pandemic. If you look at our international peers, some of our international peers have already gone back to school. In Finland, they already went back to school for 2 weeks before the summer break. But that's because they took seriously responding to the pandemic. They took seriously masks. They took seriously testing and contact tracing. They took seriously the need to make it safe to go back to school. And then they invested in public education to make sure that their schools were ready to operate safely. We haven't done any of that. So the current administration, their response to the pandemic has been outrageous. And we are also now, I think, missing an opportunity to make schools better going into this next period, right? To address all the things that Carrie and Travis have been describing. That will take resources and it will take political will. And certainly we haven't seen that from the current administration.
Resources, political will, and even more time, Carrie. What do you see as the head of a parents' union? Do you see there being any possibility of parents mobilizing to demand that the kind of environment that you want your boys to go back to is made available? Are parents about to rise up on this?
Well, I'll tell you, they're trying to do it on the local level. It's very difficult while trying to stay safe at the same time. We have delegates in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. who have helped us to create the Parent Bill of Rights, which is our line in the sand, our expectations around health, around safety, around equity in remote learning, the conditions by which we are willing to engage with school systems again. But we're also at the crossroads of a racial uprising at the same time. And we've got to be able to walk and chew gum. I've got to reference back to what you were saying. The belief gap is very real. Systemic racism is not exclusive to police reform. Education reform and the systemic racism that exists in education is not being seriously addressed. The majority of our teachers are white. I have not seen any deep or courageous conversations on the part of the majority white educators to address implicit bias that goes on in our classrooms. Frankly, we have educators leading classrooms that do not believe children like mine are capable of proficiency, let alone excellence. My kids are beautiful and bright and talented, and all of us keep talking about the fact that talent is equitably distributed, opportunity is not. That's why the opportunity gap exists. Until we have a very, very deep conversation about the biases that exist on the part of educators, we are not going to disassemble this racism. And kids like mine are going to be pushed out and dismissed, and we are losing on incredible opportunities to make advancements as a society by throwing these kids away. Our kids deserve better. We as parents are demanding better, and this is the time. If we're going to have some courageous conversations, we should be having them now.
Yeah, and I'm going to employ my fellow journalists to say we should be writing about it now. It should be a subject that's as much in the news as COVID-19 itself is in the news. And so many of us are writing about these stories of inequities in America. Travis, I want to ask you about this, what Carrie brought up. We were talking about it before. I was just reading an article in Education Week that talks about what she just said. The majority of K-12 teachers are white. They preside in classrooms with an increasing number of students of color, Blacks and Hispanics, and a declining number of white students. It's a racial divide, and Carrie said it so eloquently. Your research is showing it as well. This appears to be harmful to our children, and that Black and brown children, all children really would benefit by a more diverse group of educators in our schools. Am I right or am I wrong?
Yeah, so you are right. And I first, as a researcher, I start with science. So there is clear evidence that for Black and Latinx children, that having a Black and Latinx teacher in front of them allows them to persist through K-12 schools, allows them to perform better on quote unquote standardized exams, decreases rates of being expelled or being suspended. So there is science behind this, right? So there's clear evidence that teachers of color matter for students. So beyond science, there is this. It is important for democracy to have diverse representation. You can't be what you can't see. And that is true for children of color, and it's also true for white children. Before I was in the faculty at UC Berkeley so even here at UC Berkeley and at Boston University, at the end of the semester, I would have white students come up to me and say, and these are undergrads and graduate students, who would say, you are the first Black male teacher I've ever had in my life. And that means something. I think it means something, and it helps us understand why during the State of the Union, we would have a congressperson yell, "You lie," on national television to the first Black president of the United States. So it creates a great deal of cognitive dissonance. And I think we owe it to white children, we owe it to Black and brown children, we owe it to Asian children and Native American children to have a diverse workforce, because it is part and central to this democracy that we have a teacher workforce that represents the rich diversity. So there is science, and it's, I think, central to this American project that we have diverse teachers.
Diverse teachers who might bring diverse backgrounds and inclusion of the history that really is the rich history of America. John, I want to ask you about this because we talk about curriculum relevancy. We just celebrated Juneteenth, and many people in America, it was like they heard it for the first time, as if most of us had been living on the moon and we didn't know about this. We hadn't heard about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Some people in Tulsa, Oklahoma didn't even know about Black Wall Street. How on earth does something like that happen in America? Is it because there is no curriculum relevancy about the children who are in our schools, and it is just based on just one race instead of the race of all of us who make up this great nation?
Well, sadly, this is very much a part of our history. It's very much a part of the 400 years of anti-Blackness, that the story of America has been told in a way that erases the contributions of people of color. Much of it is very intentional. If you look at the period after the Civil War, the Daughters of the Confederacy and others organized to make sure that state standards and state textbooks would tell a false narrative, that they would tell a story of the heroic Southern resistance, that they would glorify the Confederacy. We see that in the statues, but we also see that in the learning that students experienced since the Civil War. And so there's a lot of work to do to rethink curricula. It means changing how we approach history. It means changing how we approach literature. There was a study done recently that showed some elementary school reading curricula have more characters that are animals than characters that are people of color. So kids at very young ages just don't see themselves represented. And so the task is we have to change the curriculum. We also have to change how teachers are trained. We have to make sure, because we're still going to have a lot of white teachers, right? Majority of our kids are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. So training for white teachers so that they have an appreciation of American diversity is hugely important. We got to rethink the kinds of things that happen for teachers before they even enter the classroom, and then the kind of professional development they receive.
Kerry John said something I think that is enormously relevant in the time that we're in. He said people organize in order to have their viewpoints manifested in the way that they want them to be. You are all about organizing. Do you have hope? Are you optimistic that this really can be a moment, a change moment in a movement to create more equity in education in America? And I mean, really be honest with me. Do you think that this could be that moment? Because we've had a lot of moments, but could this be a defining one?
I'm cautiously hopeful because we do have so many moments, and there has been so much pain, and again, not a lot of restorative justice. But it's slow, this process. So I try to be cautious in that. Before I answer your question, I do want to say what these guys are saying about diversity in teachers and how critically important. My Miles is 8 years old. And our friend Marielle, who actually works with John, just graduated from the Harvard Graduate School of Education with her PhD. And I said, baby, look at Marielle, like she just graduated. This is so wonderful. She's a doctor. And he said to me, oh, well, that's nice. But when I'm a doctor, I'm going to have much more pizza at my party. So they see excellence. They dream big. Of course he's going to be a doctor. He should be. He's brilliant. And I want him to think that way. That is why these things are so important. And I think we as parents are hopeful. Well, it's a couple of things. We can't do anything other than be hopeful because these are our babies. We cannot give up hope. This is not a hobby for us. Like, I got to go in and do my real job, which is being their mama in just a few minutes. This is our heart. This is our drive. This is our hope for the future. But parents now have more information about our children than we ever have before because we are teaching them at home. If you have a K through sixth grader, you are the facilitator of education. We have a lot of data, a lot of information. We are forced to be engaged. We are also, at this point, the curators of curriculum. A lot of the conversation unions across this country, the state unions and the different parent organizations are having is about sharing information and resources about how we can be the curators of curriculum and introduce Afrocentric curriculum because we get to decide what our kids are learning in the living room right now. So we're not ready to give up that control. We want to be a part of this conversation. And frankly, we're not going to be invited to the table, but we're coming. We're having our Shirley moment, and we will bring our seat to the table and join the conversation. But I think that all of our national polling for the National Parents Union tell us that by a 2-to-1 margin, parents do not want to shove their kids back into the same old education box. They want more, they want different. They look at this challenge as an unprecedented time for opportunity to think bigger and to think differently and to innovate and really grab a hold of all of these options and this power. It's really up to the system in terms of whether or not they're going to engage and harness all of this parent power. And I got to tell you something, this is a very wounded relationship with families. Because if you're a survivor of the public education system like I am, when an educator or a school or a system wants to engage with me, I got my dukes up. I assume negative intent because I've seen it firsthand. So you've got to understand that parents are coming from a wounded place. We're channeling that into action to make sure our voices are heard. And you're seeing it in beautiful pockets of parent power across this country. Hopefully, all of these voices, and frankly, we have a team leading our organization of 16 Black and brown women who are leading this conversation and fighting for their place at the table. We're hopeful that it will be respected in this country.
We're coming to the end of our time, and Carrie, you may have given us the perfect word to end on. It makes me think about the whole idea of organizing and power. And Dr. King, as you well know, said power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. So it's a need to balance the power and the love that we all have for our children, and exercise that love into power to making a change for what happens for our children when they go back into schools. I want to thank you, Travis, John, and Carrie, for being with us. It was a great conversation. I loved it. I'm sorry we have to stop, but we do because we're out of time. I want to thank the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I want to thank this organization for making this conversation possible. As I said, I wish we didn't have to leave, but we do. It's been fun. Thank you very much. I hope we push the conversation forward, and I hope what we're doing is giving people in this audience, journalists, ideas. There's a lot to write about, and there's a lot to pay attention to of what's happening on this education platform. And by writing about it, paying attention, tracking it, maybe we can help to make a difference of what public, private, parochial, etc. education looks like in America. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you all for joining in and watching. Enjoy the rest of the convention. Take care, everybody.